Agatha Cross had always been the kind of woman who approached life with logic, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. After 20 years of working as a high-stakes real estate attorney in Boston, handling multi-million-dollar property disputes and fighting ruthless developers in court, she had finally decided to step away from the chaos of the city and build a life where she could breathe. She had spent years watching people destroy each other over land, title disputes, fraudulent sales and broken contracts, and it had made her cautious, some would even say cold. She had learned through years of bitter legal battles that homes weren't just property. They were history, identity, and power. And power, when threatened, made people desperate. The house she bought wasn't just a random choice. She had picked it carefully, with the same precision she used when analyzing legal loopholes. It was a colonial-style property in a quiet, affluent town on the East Coast, set slightly apart from the main residential area, but still close enough to be considered part of the community. The house had been on the market for nearly 2 years, sitting vacant and ignored, despite its spacious design, beautiful wraparound porch, and large backyard. That alone had intrigued her. She had researched its history, who owned it before, why it hadn't sold, if there had been any legal entanglements. The records were clean, aside from a minor dispute over property lines nearly 15 years ago. Nothing unusual. No lawsuits, no foreclosures, no deaths inside the house. To Agatha, it was perfect. Moving day was exhausting, as expected. The movers arrived late, the boxes weren't labeled properly, and by the time the last piece of furniture was inside, the sun had already set, leaving the house in eerie silence. She didn't mind the quiet, though in fact she welcomed it. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up to honking cars, police sirens, or the constant hum of city life. Here all she could hear was the rustling of the trees outside and the occasional chirp of crickets. The house smelled like fresh paint and sawdust from the minor renovations she had requested before moving in, and as she walked through the dimly lit hallways, she felt something rare, a sense of ownership, of finally having something that was hers and hers alone. No legal disputes, no contracts, no contingencies. The first time she met Karen Bishop, it was just after sunrise on her second morning in the house. Agatha had woken early, still not adjusted to the change in her routine, and decided to take a walk around her new neighborhood. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and perfectly maintained lawns, the kind of suburbia that real estate agents described as charming and idyllic in their listings. She had barely stepped off her driveway when she saw a woman standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed, watching her. It wasn't a casual glance or the polite curiosity of a neighbor seeing someone new move in. This was something else, something deliberate, something calculated. Karen was in her early 50s, with short, carefully styled blonde hair, and the kind of posture that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. She was dressed as if she had stepped out of a country club, pressed beige slacks, a light cardigan draped over her shoulders, and an expression that wavered between forced friendliness and outright scrutiny. Agatha, never one to shy away from confrontation, met her gaze head-on and nodded. "You must be new here," Karen said after a long pause, her tone carrying the distinct weight of someone who saw themselves as an authority. "I am. Just moved in yesterday," Agatha replied, keeping her voice neutral. Karen's eyes flicked over the house, her lips pursing slightly. "That's surprising." Agatha raised an eyebrow. Surprising how? Karen gave a small, tight smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, it's just that this house has always belonged to the Bishops. My family's lived here for generations." Agatha frowned slightly, the words catching her off guard. She had done her research. The last owner was a retired professor who had lived alone before moving to a nursing home. There had been no mention of the Bishops anywhere in the property history. "I wasn't aware of that," Agatha said carefully. "From what I saw, the last owner was someone named Gregory Lane." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something in her expression tightened. "Gregory married into our family. That house was never really his. It's always been ours." There was something unsettling about the way she said it. Ours. As if Agatha's ownership of the property was irrelevant, as if she had simply borrowed it for a time but would eventually have to give it back. "Well," Agatha said, keeping her voice measured. "As of last week, it's mine." Karen stared at her for a moment longer, and then her expression shifted into something more pleasant, more rehearsed. "Of course. Welcome to the neighborhood." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Agatha standing there with an inexplicable sense of unease curling in her stomach. It didn't end there. Over the next few days, Karen made her presence known in ways that were too persistent to be accidental. Agatha would catch glimpses of her standing across the street, watching the house. Once, she saw her peering through the fence into her backyard. Another time, she came outside to find Karen standing by the mailbox, running her fingers along the edge as if she were testing its familiarity. When Agatha asked if she needed something, Karen just smiled and said, "Just making sure everything's still the way it should be." Then the little inconveniences started. Her mail stopped arriving. Packages that were marked as delivered never showed up. One night, the power in the house cut out, and when she checked the electrical panel, she found that someone had tampered with the switches outside. It could have been a coincidence, but Agatha didn't believe in coincidences, not when they stacked up like this. Then came the letter. It arrived without a return address, just a folded sheet of paper slipped into her doorframe. The message was typed, no signature, no indication of who had sent it. "You don't belong here. The house remembers who it belongs to." Agatha read the note twice, then a third time, her grip tightening on the paper. She wasn't easily rattled. She had faced aggressive developers, hostile clients, and courtroom intimidation tactics designed to break her resolve. But this was different. This wasn't a legal battle. It wasn't a contract dispute or a zoning issue. This was personal. She glanced out the window toward the street. Karen was there, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk, looking directly at the house. She wasn't smiling this time. Agatha exhaled slowly. So, that was how it was going to be. Agatha Cross had spent her career unraveling complex property disputes, exposing fraud and dismantling the legal loopholes that people tried to use to manipulate the system. She knew how ownership worked not just on paper but in reality. You couldn't simply claim something belonged to you because you believed it did. The law didn't care about sentimentality or personal history. It dealt in facts, contracts, and signatures. And yet, in the days that followed her unsettling encounter with Karen Bishop, she started to feel like none of that mattered in this town. It began with minor inconveniences, things that, on their own, could have been brushed off as bad luck. She noticed that her trash cans were being knocked over in the early hours of the morning, their contents strewn across her driveway in a way that suggested it wasn't just raccoons or the wind. The mail continued to be an issue. Official documents she had been expecting, things related to her home insurance and final closing paperwork, never arrived. When she checked with the post office, they assured her that deliveries had been made. A neighbor mentioned in passing that Karen had a tendency to stand by the mailboxes every afternoon, watching as the postal worker made their rounds. That same neighbor, a man in his 70s who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, hesitated before adding, "She's always had a strong attachment to that house. Used to talk about it like it was still hers, even after her family lost it." Lost it. Agatha latched onto those words. Not sold. Not moved out of willingly. Lost. She wanted to know more, but pressing too hard this early would put her in a position of weakness. Instead, she decided to be patient, to observe Karen as closely as Karen was watching her. And that was when the truly disturbing incidents began. It was late one evening when she first heard the noise of faint, metallic clicking coming from the backyard. She had been in the kitchen, unpacking one of the final boxes, when the sound cut through the silence. At first she thought it might be the old gate creaking in the wind, but when she stepped out onto the back porch, the night was still. The gate was closed. The trees swayed gently, their dark outlines shifting under the glow of the streetlights, but there was no wind strong enough to move metal. Then she saw it. Near the side of the house, just below the bedroom window, something had been placed on the grass. A small object, barely visible in the dim light. She hesitated before stepping closer, instincts honed from years in high-stakes litigation warning her that whatever she was about to find would only confirm the nagging feeling she had been pushing down since the day she moved in. It was a key. An old, rusted key with an intricate design on its bow, the kind that belonged to locks made decades ago, long before modern security systems and reinforced doors. There was no note, no explanation, just the key, placed deliberately in a spot where she would find it. Agatha bent down, picking it up carefully, turning it over in her fingers. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been left there for hours, absorbing the night air. She looked up at the window above. Her window. Whoever had left the key had been standing here, directly beneath the room where she slept. Her first instinct was to call the police. It was the rational thing to do. But something stopped her. She already knew how this would go. No forced entry, no direct threat. Just a key. They would take a report, tell her they couldn't do much, and that would be the end of it. She had handled enough legal cases to know that unless she had solid evidence that someone was actively trying to harm her, there was nothing the law could do. Instead, she did something else. The next morning, she went to the local hardware store and bought new locks, heavy-duty ones, that would make it impossible for anyone to get in without forcing their way through. She installed them herself, taking her time to ensure that every entry point was secured. Then, she set up motion-activated lights around the backyard and changed the security code on the garage. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. That night, she left the old key on the porch. A test. By dawn, it was gone. Days passed, and Karen's presence became more intrusive. She no longer just watched from a distance. She started approaching the house at odd hours, lingering near the fence line, as if waiting for something. One afternoon, Agatha returned from the grocery store to find Karen standing at her front steps, running a hand along the wooden railing. Agatha didn't hesitate. "Do you need something?" Karen turned slowly, her face perfectly composed, as if she hadn't just been caught trespassing. "I was just remembering." Remembering what? A wistful sigh. How things used to be. Agatha stepped forward, making it clear that this wasn't a casual conversation. "Karen, I understand that you have some history with this house, but it belongs to me now. I need you to respect that." For the first time, Karen's carefully curated politeness cracked, just slightly. "You don't understand." Her voice was quieter now, more controlled. "Some places aren't meant to change hands. Some places don't belong to just anyone." Agatha crossed her arms. "Are you threatening me?" Karen smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course not. I'm just saying, you should really think about whether this is the right place for you." Agatha didn't answer. She didn't need to. The weight of Karen's words lingered long after she finally walked away, disappearing down the sidewalk like she had never been there at all. That night, Agatha double-checked every lock in the house. She made sure the security system was armed. Then she sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at the empty front yard, waiting. And just before midnight, she saw movement, a figure in the darkness. A shape shifting near the fence line, not moving toward the house. Just standing there, watching. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She needed more than just suspicion. She needed proof. So she waited. And Karen waited too. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Agatha Cross had spent her life in the world of real estate law, where conflicts were rarely about emotions and almost always about money. She was used to clients fighting over property lines, inheritance disputes, and contract loopholes, but those battles had rules, and they always ended with a clear legal resolution. This situation with Karen Bishop was different. It wasn't just a neighborly disagreement, and it wasn't about legalities. This was personal, and Agatha could feel the invisible line between them growing thinner with every encounter. The night she first saw Karen standing at the edge of the fence, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this woman intimidate her. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and sacrificed too much to let a delusional woman make her feel unsafe in her own home. If Karen wanted to play games, Agatha would make sure she lost. She installed additional security measures the next morning, not just the standard locks and cameras, but more advanced precautions: glass break sensors on the windows, reinforced deadbolts, and even a secondary lock on her bedroom door. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but she wasn't foolish either. She knew that an obsessive person who believed she had been wronged was capable of anything, It didn't take long for Karen to react. 3 nights later, Agatha woke to the sound of her doorbell ringing. She glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. The sound was sharp, urgent, unnatural at that hour. She sat up, every muscle tensed, listening. Another ring. Then another. She moved quietly, stepping barefoot onto the cold floor, and reached for her phone before approaching the door. Through the peephole, she saw nothing but darkness. No movement, no sign of anyone outside. But as she turned to check the security monitor, the motion-activated camera feed blinked to life. There, standing just off to the side of the porch, barely visible in the shadows, was Karen. She wasn't knocking. She wasn't calling out. She was just standing there. Agatha exhaled slowly. She had already decided that she wasn't going to engage Karen directly again, not like this. Not at night, not alone. She backed away from the door and turned off the interior lights, making it clear she wasn't responding. The doorbell rang one more time, then silence. When she checked the camera feed again a few minutes later, Karen was gone. The next morning, Agatha found something new waiting for her on the front steps. A small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath a smooth stone. She picked it up cautiously, already knowing it wouldn't contain anything good. "You don't understand what this place means. You never will." She gritted her teeth. This was escalating, and she needed to put a stop to it before it reached a point of no return. She drove straight to the local police station, determined to file an official report. The officer at the front desk was polite but visibly unimpressed as she explained the situation. He nodded along, took notes, but she could tell from his body language that he didn't think this was serious. "We can send a unit by to check on things, but unless she's committed a crime, there's not much we can do," he said finally. Agatha clenched her jaw. "What about trespassing? Harassment?" The officer sighed. "Technically, she hasn't crossed onto your property in a way that constitutes a criminal offense. And as for the notes, there's no direct threat, just vague language." He hesitated. "I'd recommend getting a restraining order if you feel unsafe." Agatha could have laughed at the absurdity of it. A restraining order would take weeks, and Karen would see it as a declaration of war. The last thing she wanted was to provoke her into something worse. Still, she left the station with a copy of the report, making sure there was a paper trail. She knew from experience that documentation mattered. If this escalated further, she wanted proof that she had tried to go through the proper channels. That evening, she received her answer. At exactly 11:37 p.m., her phone vibrated with a notification from the security system. Motion detected backyard. Her heart pounded as she pulled up the live feed. The night vision footage flickered to life, showing the familiar view of her backyard, the tall fence, the neatly arranged patio furniture. And Karen. She was inside the yard. Agatha felt a surge of adrenaline, her mind instantly calculating her options. She could call the police again, but would they even arrive in time? Would they take it seriously? Karen wasn't moving. She was standing in the middle of the yard, looking directly at the back door. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. She stayed like that for several long seconds, then turned, walked to the edge of the fence, and disappeared into the darkness. Agatha sat frozen for a moment, her breathing uneven. This wasn't just passive aggression anymore. This was a violation, a test, a message. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she called a private security consultant. Not some cheap installation service, but a former investigator who specialized in home protection. He arrived that afternoon, a tall man in his late 40s with the kind of demeanor that suggested he had seen far worse than obsessive neighbors. "She's testing you," he said after reviewing the footage. "She wants to see how far she can push before you break." Agatha exhaled sharply. "I won't break," he nodded. "Then we make sure she knows that." They reinforced the property with additional security layers, taller fencing in key areas, sensors hidden in the grass near the perimeter, even a secondary lock system for the doors. It was extreme, but Agatha wasn't taking chances. For a few days, things were quiet. Karen didn't appear. No notes, no disturbances, just silence. Then, late one evening, Agatha noticed something strange. A flickering light in the upstairs hallway, a hallway she wasn't in. Her breath caught. She knew without a doubt that every light in the house had been off. She moved quickly but cautiously, grabbing the heaviest object within reach, a fireplace poker, and made her way toward the stairs. The air felt different, charged with something electric and wrong. She reached the second floor and turned the corner into the hallway. The light bulb above flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Her grip on the poker tightened as she listened, every nerve on high alert. There was no sound, no movement. Then she smelled it. A faint, familiar scent, something that shouldn't be there. Perfume. A scent she had only smelled on one person, Karen. Agatha backed away slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. She reached for her phone, dialing the only number she trusted at that moment. The security consultant picked up after one ring. "She's been inside," Agatha said, voice steady despite the terror clawing at her spine. "I'm on my way," he replied without hesitation. She didn't wait. She left the house immediately, stepping out into the cold night air, locking the door behind her. She didn't need proof. She didn't need logic. She knew Karen had been in her house, and she wasn't done yet. Agatha Cross had handled many property disputes over the years, but never had she encountered one where her opponent acted as if reality didn't apply to them. In the legal world, ownership was determined by contracts, financial transactions, and verifiable documents. But Karen Bishop was operating on something much more dangerous, a belief, and belief, when strong enough, could turn into obsession, and obsession led to desperation. Agatha wasn't just dealing with a neighbor who had boundary issues. She was dealing with someone who had convinced herself that Agatha was an intruder in her own home. She had tried everything, reporting Karen's actions to the police, increasing security, reinforcing her property, but none of it seemed to deter her. If anything, Karen had become more emboldened. The night Agatha realized Karen had been inside the house was a breaking point. No doors had been forced open, no windows shattered, but she had smelled her. That faint, unmistakable trace of perfume that didn't belong there, lingering in the upstairs hallway like a whisper in the dark. Someone might have dismissed it as paranoia, but Agatha knew better. This was a message. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in her car, parked across the street, watching the house, waiting for movement, waiting for Karen to return. But the street remained quiet. No shadows in the windows, no figures slipping between the trees. Just the eerie stillness of an unspoken war. By morning, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for Karen's next move. She was going to force her hand. That day, she went to the county clerk's office and requested a complete historical record of the property. She had already done this before moving in, but now she wanted more. She wanted to know exactly what had happened with the Bishop family, how they had lost the house, and why Karen seemed to believe she was entitled to it. The records took hours to go through. Some were digital, others were stored in old filing cabinets, yellowed with age. The woman at the desk gave her a curious look when she handed over the paperwork. "This property's been clean for a long time," she said casually. "Not sure what you're hoping to find." Agatha gave a tight smile. "Neither am I, but she did find something. 15 years ago, the house had been seized in a foreclosure. The original owner? Karen's father, William Bishop. The name wasn't surprising. Agatha had already assumed as much. But what caught her attention was the date of foreclosure and the circumstances surrounding it. William Bishop hadn't just failed to make payments. There had been allegations of fraud, claims that he had forged documents, tried to reclaim the property through illicit means, and had even threatened the new owners after losing the house. It felt disturbingly familiar. Agatha's fingers tightened around the paper. Karen wasn't the first Bishop to do this. She was just continuing where her father had failed. She spent the next few hours gathering every piece of information she could. The records showed that after William Bishop lost the house, he had spiraled multiple arrests for trespassing, restraining orders filed against him by the subsequent owners. And then, 15 years ago, he had disappeared. No forwarding address, no final legal proceedings. He had simply stopped existing in the system. Agatha sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Had Karen taken up his fight because she genuinely believed the house was hers, or was she covering up something else? Either way, Agatha now had a legal weapon. If Karen tried anything further, she could present this history in court, proving a pattern of harassment tied directly to her family. But Karen was always one step ahead. That night, Agatha returned home to find her front door unlocked. She froze on the porch, every muscle in her body tightening. She knew she had locked it that morning. The deadbolt had been secured. The security system should have alerted her to any breach. And yet the door was open. Her heart pounded as she reached into her bag, pulling out the small can of pepper spray she had started carrying. She pushed the door open further, stepping cautiously inside. The house was silent, the air thick with a sense of wrongness. She moved through each room methodically, checking for signs of disturbance. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. But then, as she reached the kitchen, she saw it. A plate of food, set neatly on the counter, as if someone had just finished preparing a meal. A sandwich, a glass of water, a folded napkin beside it. She hadn't made it. The room swayed slightly as her pulse roared in her ears. Someone had been in her house not to steal, not to destroy, but to live in it. A sharp, cold realization settled over her. Karen wasn't just trying to get her to leave. She was reclaiming the house, piece by piece. Agatha backed out of the kitchen, her fingers tightening around the pepper spray. She moved swiftly, exiting the house without making a sound. Once outside, she locked the door, got into her car, and drove straight to the security consultant's office. He met her with a grim expression as she explained what had happened. "This isn't a boundary dispute anymore," he said finally. "This is psychological warfare." Agatha didn't disagree. He upgraded the security system again, adding internal motion detectors and hidden cameras in key locations inside the house. Then he gave her something new, a panic button that would send an instant distress signal if she ever needed help. It was a precaution, but she had a feeling she would need it soon, because Karen wasn't done. The next day, Agatha received another letter. This time, it was hand-delivered. She found it tucked neatly into her mailbox, with no envelope, no pretense of anonymity. Believe while you can. That was it. No explanation, no signature. Agatha took a slow breath, folding the paper carefully before placing it in her file of evidence. She wasn't going anywhere. That evening, she sat by the window watching the street, waiting. And just after midnight, Karen appeared. She walked slowly, deliberately, stopping in front of the house, her gaze fixed on the upstairs window on Agatha's window. She lifted a hand and pressed her palm against the air, as if she were touching something invisible. Then she whispered something. Agatha couldn't hear the words, but she saw Karen's lips move. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked away. Agatha sat there for a long time after that, the silence stretching between them like an unfinished conversation. She wasn't sure what Karen had whispered, but she was sure of one thing. This wasn't over. Agatha Cross knew that she had crossed into dangerous territory. There was no more pretending that Karen Bishop was just a bitter woman clinging to memories of a house she had lost years ago. The situation had moved beyond petty intimidation or obsessive nostalgia. This was something darker, something that followed no logic, no legal precedent, no rational course of action, and Agatha was beginning to realize that Karen would not stop until she had driven her out completely. The morning after finding the message scrawled across the back wall of her house, Agatha called in a professional cleaning crew. She refused to touch it herself, refused to let Karen's actions get under her skin any more than they already had. The workers arrived within an hour, spraying the red letters with chemicals, scrubbing the walls until there was no trace left. But even as the paint disappeared, Agatha felt no relief. The damage had already been done. The words might have been washed away, but their meaning remained. She knew Karen was watching. She felt her eyes from across the street, felt the weight of her presence even when she couldn't see her. And then, as if to confirm it, Karen's voice drifted over the fence. "You can clean it off, but it doesn't change anything." Agatha turned sharply, scanning the yard, but Karen was nowhere in sight. She hadn't heard the gate open. She hadn't seen anyone approach. The voice had come from somewhere close, but the yard was empty. A chill crept up her spine as she backed toward the house, locking the door behind her. By that evening, exhaustion settled into her bones. The stress of constant vigilance, of never feeling safe, was wearing her down. But she would not let Karen win. She turned on every light in the house, double-checked the locks, and forced herself to focus on something other than the paranoia clawing at the edges of her mind. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to remind herself that she was still in control. Then the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house instantly. The glow of the streetlights outside barely cut through the heavy night, casting long, stretched shadows against the walls. The sudden silence pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. Her first thought was a neighborhood-wide outage, but when she looked out the window, the other houses still glowed with warm, inviting light. It was just her house. The logical part of her brain urged her to stay calm. A blown fuse. A simple electrical failure. It was an old house, after all. But then she heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first, drifting in from the hallway. The slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard bending under weight. Someone was inside. Agatha didn't move. She forced herself to listen, to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. Another step, closer this time. The darkness made everything sharper, every noise amplified, every breath deafening. She reached for her phone, gripping it tightly as she activated the emergency call button. A second later, her security system sent an alert. Back door open. She had locked it. She was sure she had locked it. She pressed her back against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Whoever was inside had realized she was aware. They were waiting, watching, calculating their next move. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power surged back on. The house flooded with light, revealing empty hallways, undisturbed furniture, and a perfectly shut back door. The security alert had been real, but now, as she stared at the screen, it no longer showed any sign of forced entry. The air in the house felt wrong. Heavy. Stagnant. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with a kitchen knife within reach, staring at the back door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. By sunrise, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for Karen's next move. She needed to end this before it got worse. She drove straight to the county office and requested every document related to the property records older than what she had initially reviewed, deeper history that might explain why Karen was so convinced that this house belonged to her. The clerk hesitated when he saw the request, glancing at her with something almost like curiosity. This property's had incidents before he finally said, pulling up the files, owners coming and going, strange complaints. You sure you want to dig into this? Agatha didn't hesitate. Yes, the files were thick, too thick for a house that had supposedly been nothing more than a typical family home, and buried within them, she found something she hadn't expected. A police report. 15 years ago, the night William Bishop, Karen's father, died. She read through the pages slowly, absorbing every detail. He hadn't just disappeared, as Karen had implied. He had died inside the house. The exact cause was never determined. The report mentioned that there were no signs of forced entry, but the crime scene had been unusual. Furniture had been overturned, deep scratch marks found along the walls, as if something had been dragged across them. The responding officers had noted the smell of fresh paint in the air, even though nothing had been newly painted. And the final line of the report sent a shiver down her spine. No one else was found inside, but the back door was wide open. Agatha shut the file, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Karen knew. She had always known, and now everything made sense. Karen wasn't just fighting for the house. She was guarding it. By the time Agatha returned home, the exhaustion had settled into something deeper, resignation. This wasn't a battle she could fight with legal action or police intervention. Karen wasn't interested in winning through official means. She had already decided that Agatha didn't belong here, and she would do whatever it took to drive her out. She walked through the house, scanning every corner, every door frame, every window latch. She half expected something to be waiting for her, a new message, another violation of her space. But the house was quiet. The security system remained undisturbed. The locks were still in place. And yet, as she stepped into the kitchen, her stomach twisted. On the table, where she had left an empty glass the night before, there was now a plate of food. A simple sandwich. A glass of water. A napkin folded neatly beside it. She stared at it, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She hadn't made it. She hadn't left anything out. Someone had been here, not to vandalize, not to steal, but to live. A deep, creeping realization settled over her. Karen wasn't just trying to drive her away. She was replacing her. Agatha stepped back slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Then, from just beyond the kitchen doorway, a voice. Low. Almost tender. "You really should leave now," Agatha spun, heart slamming against her ribs. But the doorway was empty. The house was silent. And Karen was nowhere in sight. Agatha Cross had spent her entire career tearing apart fraudulent property claims, exposing manipulation, and ensuring that people who thought they could bend reality to their will were met with the full weight of the law. But Karen Bishop had built something different, something that no contract, police report, or restraining order could break. It wasn't about paperwork or legality anymore. It was about control, and Agatha felt it slipping through her fingers with every passing day. The house had begun to feel less like hers and more like something borrowed, something she was merely occupying until Karen decided to take it back. The walls no longer felt solid, the locks no longer secure. The air inside had changed. Every time she walked through the rooms, there was a feeling, a presence pressing against her skin, something unseen but undeniably there. She had tried to fight it with logic, with reinforcement, with the certainty that she was the legal owner, but none of it mattered. Karen had spent too many years weaving herself into this place, embedding her obsession so deeply into its bones that it had started to feel as though the house itself wanted her to leave. And then, one night, it finally happened. She had forced herself to go to bed early, exhaustion wearing down her nerves, but sleep never came easily in this house anymore. Every sound felt amplified, every creak of the wooden floors carrying something sinister beneath it. Sometime after midnight, just as she had started to drift into uneasy rest, the alarm system went off. The piercing sound sent a jolt through her body as she sat up, heart hammering against her ribs. The security panel beside her bed flashed bright red breach detected. Front door. Her stomach twisted violently. She reached for her phone, hands unsteady as she activated the security feed. The front camera flickered to life, and there, standing in the open doorway, was Karen. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking in, wasn't making a sudden attack. She just stood there, framed in the dim glow of the porch light, the wind tugging lightly at her clothes. Agatha's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. She had locked that door. She was certain of it. Karen slowly lifted a hand, resting it against the doorframe as if feeling something, and then, in a voice just loud enough to cut through the alarm, she said, "You shouldn't have come here." Agatha didn't hesitate. She hit the panic button on her phone, sending a distress signal to the security company and the police. But Karen didn't flinch. She didn't turn to leave. She stepped inside. Agatha shot out of bed, heart racing. She grabbed the nearest heavy object, a metal flashlight, from her nightstand and moved quickly, keeping her back to the wall, listening. The alarm was still blaring, but Karen acted as if she didn't hear it at all. Then, suddenly, the alarm cut off. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Agatha reached the hallway just in time to see Karen standing near the base of the stairs, her posture relaxed, as if she had just walked into her own home after a long absence. "I told you," Karen said, her voice almost gentle. "This house doesn't belong to you." Agatha gripped the flashlight tighter, muscles locked in place. "You need to leave." Karen tilted her head slightly. "I never left." Something about the way she said it sent a cold shock through Agatha's chest. Then she saw it. Karen's hand was bleeding. A thin trickle of blood trailed from her palm, dripping onto the hardwood floor, leaving dark red spots in a slow, methodical pattern. But she didn't seem to notice. Agatha forced herself to stay steady. The police are on their way. Karen smiled. They won't change anything. Her voice was calm. Too calm. Agatha had spent years dealing with people on the verge of snapping, people who had convinced themselves they were in the right, even when reality proved otherwise. But this wasn't just desperation. This was certainty. Karen wasn't afraid, wasn't scrambling for control. She believed she had already won. And that terrified Agatha more than anything else. A loud bang shattered the tension. The sound of a door slamming shut. Agatha turned sharply, pulse spiking, but nothing was there. The house was silent again. Karen let out a soft sigh, stepping further inside, looking around as if reacquainting herself with an old memory. You fought longer than the others, she murmured. Most people leave before it gets to this point. Agatha barely held herself back from lunging at her. What the hell are you talking about? Karen finally looked at her again, her bleeding hand leaving faint smears of red against the staircase railing as she ran her fingers along it. People don't stay, she said simply. They all think they will. They move in, fill the rooms with their furniture, bring their little families, tell themselves they belong here. But they don't. This house is patient. It knows how to get rid of them. Agatha's grip on the flashlight tightened. There's no house, there's just you. You scare people into leaving. You manipulate them, break them down until they can't take it anymore. Karen smiled again. If that's what you need to believe. She took another step forward. Agatha didn't back away. Then, from outside, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Karen's head tilted slightly, but she didn't turn. She just exhaled, shaking her head, as if disappointed. You never even tried to understand. The front door swung open violently, and two uniformed officers stormed inside, weapons drawn, hands where we can see them. For a moment, Karen stood completely still. Then, with excruciating slowness, she lifted her hands, her bloodied palm facing outward. One of the officers moved toward her, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest for trespassing and criminal harassment. Karen didn't resist. She didn't fight. As they pulled her arms behind her back, securing the cuffs, she simply turned her head slightly, looking at Agatha one last time. And then she whispered, "It's not over." The words burrowed under Agatha's skin, cold and absolute. The officers led Karen out the door, their radios crackling with muffled voices. Agatha stayed frozen, staring at the spot where she had stood. The house felt different now, heavier, like something unseen was still pressing against her. She didn't move for a long time. The sirens faded. The voices disappeared, but the silence that remained felt like a warning. The silence inside the house stretched endlessly after Karen was taken away. The flashing red and blue lights outside cast shifting shadows along the walls, painting the rooms in brief moments of unnatural color before fading again. Agatha stood motionless near the staircase, gripping the banister with a force that made her knuckles ache, but she barely felt it. The officers had left the door open when they pulled Karen outside, and the cold night air seeped in, chilling the sweat on her skin. But even as she watched the empty threshold, even as she heard the distant voices of the police radio and the rustling of uniforms, she felt no relief. Karen was gone, but the house still felt occupied. She forced herself to move, to step forward and push the door shut, locking it behind her. The deadbolt slid into place with a dull, mechanical clunk, a sound that should have reassured her, but it didn't. She turned her back to it, scanning the dimly lit hallway, half expecting to see something watching her from the shadows. The sensation of being observed hadn't left, not even after Karen had been dragged away in handcuffs, and the memory of her parting words dug into Agatha's mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. It's not over. A simple statement, spoken without anger or desperation, as though Karen had been explaining something inevitable. And the worst part was, Agatha believed her. The house was too quiet. She moved carefully through the rooms, checking the locks again, glancing at the security monitors to reassure herself that everything was as it should be, but it didn't feel right. The space around her felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened in Karen's absence. The house had never been warm, never been truly inviting, but now it felt like something waiting. She entered the kitchen, intending to pour herself a drink, to ground herself in something normal. But as she reached for a glass, her hand hesitated. The counter was clean. The plate that had been left there earlier, the meal someone had prepared as though they had been living in the house, was gone. Not thrown away, not pushed aside. Gone. Her breath hitched. She hadn't cleaned it. She hadn't touched it. Her mind scrambled for a rational explanation. The police had been in and out of the house. One of them must have seen it and gotten rid of it. Maybe one of the crime scene techs had thought it was evidence and taken it away. But that wasn't true. She had been standing there when they searched the kitchen. No one had touched the plate. No one had taken anything. A cold realization pressed against her chest, stealing the air from her lungs. Karen hadn't been the one leaving those things behind. Something else had. The back of her neck prickled, an instinctive response to danger she couldn't see. She turned sharply, scanning the empty kitchen, her pulse hammering. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to not give in to paranoia. Karen had spent weeks trying to unnerve her, trying to make her feel like she didn't belong in her own home. That was all this was, a lingering sense of unease, a trick of her exhausted mind. But she knew better. Leaving the kitchen, she moved back through the house, running her fingers along the walls, as if searching for something she had missed. The floorboards creaked beneath her steps, a familiar sound, but now it felt wrong, like the house was responding to her movement. The sensation grew worse as she neared the staircase, an overwhelming feeling that she was not alone. She hesitated at the base of the stairs, staring upward into the dim second floor. The hallway stretched out in eerie stillness, the doors to each room closed, undisturbed. But one of them wasn't locked. The door to the master bedroom. The same room where she had once smelled Karen's perfume lingering in the dark. The same room where she had first realized that someone had been inside. Her fingers tightened into a fist, nails pressing into her palm as she forced herself to step forward. The house was hers, no matter what Karen had tried to convince her of. She wasn't going to let shadows and memories push her out. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, her breath steady despite the way her chest ached with unease. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house. She reached the master bedroom door, gripping the handle tightly before pushing it open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The bed neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway, her belongings exactly where they should be. Nothing disturbed. Nothing out of place. And yet the feeling of presence was undeniable. She stepped inside, heart pounding against her ribs, scanning every inch of the room, searching for something tangible, something real. But there was nothing, just the lingering, suffocating weight of the air pressing against her skin. Then the light flickered. Her pulse jumped as the overhead bulb dimmed for just a second, a quick, unnatural fluctuation before stabilizing again. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to remain in control. She had survived worse than this. She had fought battles in courtrooms where the stakes were millions of dollars, faced down men who thought they could intimidate her into backing down. She would not let an empty house break her. But as she turned to leave, she heard it, a whisper. Soft, faint. Right behind her. She spun, breath catching in her throat, eyes scanning the room in wild desperation. But there was nothing there, no movement, no shadow. Just the mirror. The tall, antique mirror that had come with the house, the one she had never gotten around to removing. The surface was dark in the dim light, reflecting only the outline of the room, the vague shape of her own silhouette. But as she stared at it, she swore she saw something else, something standing in the doorway behind her. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She turned sharply, eyes locking onto the empty space where the figure had been. The hallway was deserted. Nothing had moved. But she knew what she had seen. A shiver ran through her, deep and primal. She backed out of the room, never turning her back to the mirror, never blinking until she was safely in the hallway. Then she slammed the door shut, locking it, sealing it away like something caged. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she had packed a bag. She told herself it was temporary. A few nights at a hotel, a chance to clear her mind, to reset, to remind herself that she was not losing control. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was leaving. And she wasn't coming back. The house had already decided that.